The year is the late 15th century. Imagine a flicker of candlelight in an abbey library illuminating a manuscript bound in dark leather. It contains instructions, warnings, and justifications for a terrifying pursuit. Outside, in villages and towns across Europe, stories circulate of men and women striking bargains with the devil, riding through storms on broomsticks, conjuring hail and pestilence. Fear is a force more potent than any army. Into this world emerges a book that will carry that fear like an ember on the wind, igniting persecutions that last generations. It is called the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches. How did this text gain such influence, and why did it echo so profoundly across Britain and Ireland? Tonight, we light the candle and open its pages. This is the Candlelight Historian, where the glow of a single flame reveals the dark corners of history. Here, belief and terror walk side by side. Every superstition, every curse, every haunted truth is another step deeper into the mind of our ancestors. Europe in fear, late medieval anxiety and theological roots. To understand the influence of the Malleus, we must first step into the atmosphere of fear that preceded it. The late medieval period was marked by social upheaval, climatic downturns, and the memory of the Black Death. Famine and plague were followed by war and unrest. Popular religiosity emphasized the presence of demons and the proximity of hell. Mystical movements flourished alongside reformist cries. Scholars like Norman Cohn and Carlo Ginzburg note that accusations of witchcraft did not spring from nowhere. They drew on centuries of demonological speculation. The Church had long condemned sorcery and pact-making, but the offences were treated as minor or foolish. Early penitentials often prescribed prayer or penance for such offences, reflecting a belief that magical practices were misguided rather than diabolical. However, by the 14th century, a shift occurred. Medieval theologians began to conceive of magic not as superstition, but as heresy. The fear of secret sects gained weight as authorities suppressed Cathars, Waldensians, and other heretical groups. Treatises by Johannes Nider and later Nicholas of Cusa began to link magic to devil worship. This new demonology was crystallized by the church councils of Basel and Constance, which considered claims of witches' sabbaths and diabolical pacts. In towns and villages, rumors about witches circulated in response to tragedies like livestock death or crop failure. In this climate of fear, two Dominican friars believed they held a divine mandate to act. They would weaponize theology against the supposed servants of Satan. Two Dominican authors, Heinrich Kramer, Jacob Sprenger, and The Making of the Manual. The authorship of the Malleus is as intriguing as its content. Heinrich Kramer, known in Latin as Henricus Institor, was a Dominican inquisitor from Austria. He gained notoriety for his zeal in pursuing witch trials in Tyrol and the Rhineland. By the late 1470s, Kramer was frustrated by local magistrates who resisted his prosecutorial fervor. In one famous case, his attempt to convict a woman named Helena Schuberin was thwarted by townspeople and the secular court. Kramer was humiliated, but he remained convinced that demons and witches were undermining Christendom. Jacob Sprenger, a fellow Dominican and theologian from Basel, is credited as co-author, though his precise contribution has been debated. Some scholars suggest Sprenger distanced himself from Kramer's excesses. Others believe he offered intellectual authority. Regardless, Kramer used their names to secure church approval for the text. In order to give the treatise legitimacy, the friars sought a papal bull. In December 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, a document acknowledging the reality of witchcraft and empowering inquisitors in Germany. The bull condemned those who used magic to harm crops, prevent procreation, or practice idolatry. It authorized Kramer and Sprenger to act where local clerics might oppose them. Armed with this papal support, the Malleus was compiled and first printed in 1486 or 1487. The book was divided into 3 parts. The first argued for the existence of witches and the danger they posed to the church. The second described how witches supposedly operated, from making pacts to casting spells and inducing storms. The third outlined judicial procedures for identifying, interrogating, and punishing witches. Kramer's voice dominates the text. His misogyny is palpable. He argued that women were more susceptible to demonic influence due to perceived weakness and carnal lust. His reasoning drew on classical and biblical texts, but twisted them into a polemic against female practitioners of magic. The book was not merely a theological treatise. It was a manual for witch hunters, providing arguments to silence skeptics and instructions for use of torture. The text as weapon. How the Malleus shaped witch trials and inquisitorial logic. Why did this book become so powerful? In part, its influence stemmed from technology. The printing press, introduced just decades earlier, enabled rapid dissemination. According to historian P.G. Maxwell Stewart, at least a dozen editions were printed by the early 16th century, particularly in German-speaking lands. Each edition amplified its reach. The Malleus presented itself as a compendium of authoritative arguments and practical guidance. Judges and inquisitors could turn to it for ready-made reasoning. The first part of the text insisted that disbelief in witches was itself heretical. This rhetorical move disarmed skeptics. It cited church fathers, theologians, and scripture to assert that witches were real and malevolent. Kramer's argument rested on a binary. Those who denied witchcraft were complicit with the devil. This section also emphasized the danger witches pose to reproduction and childbirth. By linking witchcraft to infertility and infant death, Kramer tapped into deep anxieties. The second part catalogued alleged crimes committed by witches. It described nocturnal flights to Sabbaths, sexual relations with incubi and succubi, shape-shifting, weather magic, and the use of powders and potions. These lurid details titillated and horrified readers, reinforcing the idea that witches were organized and powerful. The language was graphic and sensational. It created a sense of urgency and terror. This part also included lists of tests for witchcraft, such as the infamous water test or the search for marks on the body. The third part is where the Malleus became truly dangerous. It detailed legal procedures for convicting witches. It advised judges to rely on the testimony of other accused witches, to use torture to elicit confessions, and to disregard recantations as diabolical deception. Kramer recommended that the accused be interrogated at night and in secret, without counsel or advocate. He argued that women's tears were manipulative, that they should not be believed, and that doubts about the use of torture were impediments to justice. The manual effectively normalized extraordinary measures for an extraordinary crime. Historians like Geoffrey Russell and Brian Levac have pointed out that the Malleus was not the only legal source for witch trials. Many courts followed their own traditions and laws. Yet its impact lay in how it systematized arguments and validated severe measures. It became a reference point for judges across the Holy Roman Empire. Even critics of the text, such as Johann Weyer, who published a skeptical treatise in 1563, acknowledged its influence by arguing against it. Across the Channel. Influence on England. Unlike continental Europe, England's legal system operated without an inquisition. Witchcraft cases there were judged in common law courts rather than ecclesiastical tribunals. English law defined witchcraft as a felony, punishable by hanging rather than burning. The earliest statute against witchcraft, enacted in 1542 under Henry VIII, criminalized conjuring spirits and harming people through sorcery. The statute was repealed, then reinstated with modifications under Elizabeth I in 1563. The Malleus was never translated into English during the early modern period, yet its spirit crossed the Channel through ideas and rhetoric. Scholars such as Keith Thomas and James Sharp note that early English demonologists borrowed from European treatises. Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, criticized belief in witchcraft and explicitly referred to continental authors. Scott dismissed Kramer as a deluded zealot, but his need to refute the Malleus demonstrates its reach. Conversely, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, wrote his own demonological treatise, Demonology, in 1597. His work drew on continental demonology, including elements found in the Malleus. When he ascended the English throne, he influenced the enactment of the Witchcraft Act of 1603, which expanded penalties. However, English courts maintained a relatively cautious approach. Torture was technically illegal except under the royal prerogative. Judges relied on evidence of harm rather than confessions of diabolical pacts. The majority of accused witches were local healers or marginalized individuals. Cases like the Chelmsford witches of 1560 or the Pendle witches of 1612 reveal community tensions over property, charity, and reputation. The Malleus provided ideological justification but was not a procedural guide. Its view of a satanic conspiracy gradually seeped into pamphlets and sermons, but the legal system resisted adopting its most extreme recommendations. Across the Channel, Scotland's witch hunts. If England adopted demonology cautiously, Scotland embraced it more fervently. The Scottish Reformation and the union of Crown and Church created a climate conducive to witch hunts. The Malleus's influence filtered into Scottish thought through clergy and continental scholars. James VI's demonology synthesized arguments from the Malleus with his own beliefs. He described witches' Sabbaths, pacts, and storms, emphasizing that witches were servants of Satan. The Scottish Parliament passed a rigorous Witchcraft Act in 1563, stipulating death for those who committed witchcraft or consulted with evil spirits. The first major Scottish witch hunt occurred in 1590 when James returned from Denmark. His voyage was beset by storms, which he believed were conjured by witches. The North Berwick witch trials followed. Dozens were accused of gathering at St. Andrew's Old Kirk to plot the king's death. Testimonies extracted under torture described witches sailing in sieves, raising tempests, and conversing with the devil. The imagery echoes descriptions in the Malleus. The trial ended with multiple executions, reinforcing the reality of witches for the Scottish crown. Between 1590 and 1660, Scotland experienced waves of witch hunts. The Privy Council and Kirk sessions kept meticulous records of accusations. Historians such as Christina Lana and Julian Goodare show that Scottish authorities often relied on ministerial zeal and local witchfinders or common prickers who claimed to detect the devil's mark by piercing suspects' skin. The use of sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological manipulation to obtain confessions mirrors instructions in the Malleus. One of the most notorious episodes was the Great Scottish Witch Hunt of 1669 to 1671, when more than 400 people were accused. In Leith, Aberdeen, and Morayshire, interrogations produced lurid confessions of Sabbaths and sexual congress with demons. The subsequent executions reveal a tragic pattern. Accused women, midwives, healers, poor widows were scapegoated for local misfortunes. Men were also accused, but in smaller numbers. The Malleus argument that women were more prone to witchcraft because of perceived weakness and sexuality found fertile ground in a society already steeped in patriarchal norms. Nevertheless, not all Scottish jurists embraced Cramer's Manual. The legal treatise of Sir George Mackenzie in 1670 attempted to introduce safeguards, arguing that the testimony of witches against one another was unreliable and that a confession under torture was suspect. These ideas foreshadowed the skepticism of the Enlightenment. Across the Channel, Ireland's haunted silence. Ireland presents a contrasting case. While isolated instances of witchcraft accusations occurred, the island never experienced witch hunts on the scale seen in Scotland or continental Europe. Scholars like Andrew Snedden and Ciaran MacDonnell identify only a handful of prosecutions in Irish records. The most famous case is that of Alice Keitler in Kilkenny in 1324, centuries before the Malleus. Later cases include Florence Newton of Youghal in 1661, charged with bewitching Mary Langdon, and the island Magi witches in Antrim in 1718, where 8 women were convicted and pilloried. Why were witch hunts less common in Ireland? Several factors converge. First, the island was periphery to the Catholic and later Protestant centres that produced demonological treatises. The Malleus and similar texts were not circulated widely in Gaelic. Second, Irish legal traditions derived from Brehon laws, which placed less emphasis on capital punishment. When English common law was introduced, it coexisted with local customs. Third, the religious landscape of Ireland was complex. Catholicism persisted despite the Protestant Reformation. The Church's hierarchical structures were weakened, and local priests sometimes tolerated folk practices. Fear of witches existed in folklore, but it manifested in tales of fairies, changelings, and puka rather than demons. Finally, authorities on the island were preoccupied with war, rebellion, and plantation. Witch hunts did not align with their priorities. When Irish witch trials occurred, they often involved English or Scottish settlers. Florence Newton's case was presided over by an English judge, Sir William Aston, who drew on English precedents rather than the Malleus. The prosecution emphasized Maleficarum, harm inflicted through magic, rather than pacts with Satan. The island Magi trials were influenced by a visiting Presbyterian minister, John Tennant, who imported Scottish demonology. The accused were poor women scapegoated for illness and misfortune, yet the punishment, pillorying, suggests a relative leniency compared to burning or hanging. Thus, while the Malleus influenced wider European thought, its echoes in Ireland were faint, filtered through the prism of local culture and law. The hammer falls: skepticism, decline, and Enlightenment backlash. By the late 17th century, skepticism about witchcraft grew across Europe. Legal scholars, physicians, and philosophers began to question the validity of confessions extracted under torture and the logic of demonic pacts. In Germany, Friedrich Spee von Langenfeld published his Cautio Criminalis in 1631, criticizing the use of torture and the circular reasoning of trials. His arguments resonated with jurists who saw the cruelty of prosecutions. In England, physicians like John Webster and Thomas Brown debated the reality of witchcraft. Some remained convinced, others doubted. The scientific revolution altered perceptions of causality. Natural phenomena previously attributed to magic were explained through astronomy and physics. Diseases were understood as contagion rather than curse. The Enlightenment emphasized rationality and skepticism. Voltaire and Montesquieu ridiculed witch hunts as relics of superstition. In Scotland, Lord Advocate Sir George Mackenzie argued that extreme caution was necessary, and many trials ended in acquittals. By 1736, the Witchcraft Act was repealed in Britain. In 1682, it had been effectively unused. Yet the decline of witch hunts did not erase the impact of the Malleus. The book continued to be reprinted into the early 18th century. Its misogynistic rhetoric lingered in cultural attitudes towards women and healers. Even after skepticism prevailed, the image of the witch, riding on storms, boiling cauldrons, cursing cattle, remained in folklore. In remote areas, accusations persisted into the 19th century. The story of Bridget Cleary in late 19th century Ireland, burned by her husband under the belief she was a fairy changeling, echoes older fears. The hammer's blow reverberated long after its use was questioned. Echoes in folklore and fiction, how the text haunts culture. The Malleus was a legal manual, but it also became part of cultural memory. Its lurid depictions of witches and demons seeped into art and literature. Early modern woodcuts depict witches gathering in groves, feeding imps and concocting poisons, drawing directly from descriptions in the Malleus. The association of witches with black cats and broomsticks gained popularity through such imagery. Ballads and pamphlets turned confessions into cautionary tales. In Shakespeare's Macbeth, written in the early 17th century, the weird sisters reflect the brewings and prophecies that fill the Malleus. Their chant, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, mirrors the demonologist's fantasies. In German folklore, the Walpurgisnacht on the Brocken Mountain was said to be a witch's Sabbath. This idea resonated with the second part of the Malleus. In Scotland, tales of Black Agnes and the witches of Forfar included elements of the manual, signing the Devil's Book, flying through the air. In Ireland, fairies replaced witches, but the fear of nocturnal gatherings in ring forts echoed similar anxieties. In modern times, the Malleus has attracted scholars, artists and writers. Authors like Heinrich Heine and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe drew on its imagery. 20th century novelists and filmmakers have reinterpreted the witch craze as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria and misogyny. Works like Arthur Miller's The Crucible, though set in colonial Massachusetts, reflect themes similar to those in the Malleus: the danger of accusations, the power of fear, and the intersection of religion and law. Contemporary feminist scholars have examined the Malleus as a product of patriarchal structures, emphasizing how its gendered language reinforced control over women's bodies and knowledge. Witchcraft museums in Germany, Scotland, and the United States display copies of the Malleus as artifacts of a dark era. Legacy of Fear, Closing Reflections. What then is the legacy of the Malleus Maleficarum? On one level, it is a document of its time, a product of late medieval fear, theological contention, and the rise of print. On another level, its influence extended far beyond its initial context. It provided a template for justifying persecution, offered ideological ammunition to witch hunters, and normalized the use of torture in pursuit of confessions. In Germany, Switzerland, and parts of France, the manual contributed to tens of thousands of prosecutions. In Britain, its arguments seeped into demonological treatises and courtrooms, albeit filtered through local laws. In Scotland, its spirit fueled an intense witch craze, leaving a legacy of burned women and haunted moors. In Ireland, its echoes were faint, but the idea of harmful magic persisted in folklore. The Malleus reminds us how ideas can be weaponized when combined with fear, authority, and power. It shows how language can dehumanize, how intellectual constructs can justify cruelty. 6 centuries later, the hammer of witches still resonates. It warns against the dangers of scapegoating, against the misuse of religious and legal systems to persecute the vulnerable. The past is full of echoes. To listen to them is to recognize our responsibility in the present. Thank you for joining the Candlelight Historian. If this story spoke to you, leave a light in the dark, a like, a comment, a thought for the old fears that once kept our ancestors awake. Until next time, keep the candle burning.